Chapter 1: A Danish Distress Call in Baker Street. It was upon a particularly dreary Tuesday in late October, the London fog a greasy, pervasive blanket pressing against the panes of our familiar Baker Street sitting-room, that the monotonous hum of my life threatened to lull me into a state of utter contentment. My medical practice, though steady, offered little in the way of intellectual stimulation, and the occasional rounds at the hospital, while necessary, lacked the vibrant pulse of adventure that had, for so many years, been the true spice of my existence. I sat by the fire, a copy of the Lancet unread upon my lap, tracing the intricate patterns of the Persian rug, my thoughts drifting to past exploits, the terrifying hound, the cryptic cipher, the dizzying heights of Reichenbach. Such reminiscences, though fond, invariably brought with them a pang of melancholy, a longing for the sharp, intellectual tussle that only one man could provide. Sherlock Holmes, meanwhile, was engaged in one of his periodic retreats into the world of pure cerebration. He sat opposite me, his long, lean frame coiled in his armchair, a thin plume of smoke rising from his cherrywood pipe. His gaze, distant and unfocused, suggested that his mind traversed realms far beyond the grimy rooftops of London. I knew better than to disturb him during these intervals. They were the crucible in which the steel of his intellect was forged anew. Our comfortable inertia was abruptly shattered by the resounding knock at our door, followed by the clatter of Mrs. Hudson's hurried ascent. A moment later, the door swung open to reveal a gentleman who, despite the evident quality of his attire, bore an air of profound disquiet. He was a man of perhaps 50 years, with a scholarly brow furrowed by worry, and eyes that held the haunted look of one who had witnessed something truly inexplicable. His fair hair, though carefully combed, seemed to stand on end from recent agitation, and his hands, as he clasped them nervously, trembled ever so slightly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he inquired, his English accented but impeccable, his voice a low, urgent murmur. "My name is Professor Henrik Lund. I have travelled from Copenhagen at the earnest suggestion of Professor C.G. Jorgensen, who assured me you are the only man in Europe capable of addressing my most peculiar predicament." Holmes roused himself with a languid stretch, his eyes, now bright and alert, assessing our visitor with a swift, almost imperceptible glance. "Pray, be seated, Professor Lund," he said, gesturing to a chair. "The peculiarities of the world, however far-flung, are always of interest to me. Watson, if you would be so kind as to procure some refreshment." As I left to fetch the customary sherry, I heard Lund begin his tale, his voice gaining a desperate cadence. Upon my return, he was well into his narrative, painting a picture that, even to my seasoned ears, sounded more like a folk legend than a matter for sober investigation. Entire villages, Mr. Holmes, near the Coge Bay, utterly deserted. Not a soul remains, save for the wild animals reclaiming their former domains. And the reason, sir, the villagers insist upon it, is ghosts. Holmes took a slow puff from his pipe. "Ghosts, Professor?" A charming explanation for the superstitious, no doubt. But I confess, the supernatural rarely enters into the sphere of my investigations, save as a convenient smoke-screen for more tangible villainy. Professor Lund wrung his hands. "Ah, but these are no ordinary phantoms, Mr. Holmes. There are no shimmering figures, no rattling chains, no cold spots even." The villagers speak of an unseen terror, a pervasive, suffocating dread that settles upon them like a shroud. They report a low, maddening hum, often imperceptible to the ear, but felt deep within the bones. Many have suffered from sudden, debilitating sickness, intense vertigo, nausea, and headache so severe as to render them incoherent. And worst of all, a creeping, profound fear that twists their minds, driving them from their homes in a state of sheer panic. My medical instinct stirred. And have these afflictions been medically examined, Professor? I interjected. Indeed, Dr. Watson, Lund replied, turning to me with a glimmer of hope. The local physicians are baffled. They find no infectious agent, no physical cause for these widespread symptoms. It is as if the very air turns hostile. They speak of the whisper in the walls, of shadows that press down upon the soul. Families have simply packed a few essentials and fled, leaving behind their livelihoods, their ancestral lands, abandoning everything they hold dear. Holmes leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on Lund. And this phenomenon, Professor, it is localized? Confined to these specific villages? Precisely so. Those residing but a few kilometers away are entirely untouched, save for the anxiety of their neighbors' plight. But within the affected areas, the effect is universal, indiscriminately driving young and old alike to madness and flight. And the motive, Professor? For even a phantom, one might suppose, must have some end in view, however spectral. Lund hesitated, glancing about the room. There are whispers, Mr. Holmes. Rumors. Of a certain industrialist, a Mr. Soren Madsen. A man of formidable reputation in Danish commerce. He had, some months prior to these incidents, expressed a keen interest in acquiring these very lands. His offers, it must be said, were insultingly low, considering the generations these families had spent upon the soil. And now, with the villages deserted, he has made moves to secure these properties for a pittance. A flicker, a spark of pure intellectual delight, crossed Holmes's face. The mention of a human agent of greed and calculated malice was precisely the ingredient his logical mind required. The supernatural had melted away, leaving behind the far more intriguing prospect of a complex human design. So, Holmes murmured, a faint smile playing on his lips, a meticulously engineered haunting, you suggest. Not for mere amusement, but for profit. A fascinating proposition, Professor Lund. The application of such an insidious method, the widespread and uniform effect. This is no common ruse. He rose from his chair, a sudden energy animating his frame. Watson, our schedule, I believe, is suddenly quite open. Prepare our affairs. It seems the spectral mists of Denmark await our attention. And so it was decided. Within the hour, our bags were packed, and our minds, or at least Holmes's, already grappling with the peculiar challenges of the spectre of the sound. Copenhagen, and its unseen terrors, beckoned. Chapter 2: The Fog-Shrouded Shores of Zealand. Our journey across the North Sea was, for Holmes, a period of intense, though silent, preparation. while the rhythmic thrum of the ship's engines and the ceaseless wash of grey-green waves against the hull might have lulled a lesser man into a state of somnolence, my companion remained an edifice of focused thought. He spent his waking hours hunched over maps of the Danish coastline, his long, artistic fingers tracing the intricate waterways and the sprawling landmass of Zealand. Interspersed with these geographical studies were deep dives into obscure scientific treatises, often penned in German or French, dealing with acoustics, psychological effects of sound frequencies, and even rudimentary studies on atmospheric pressures and their impact on the human sensorium. He would underline passages with a vigorous stroke of his pen, occasionally emitting a low hum of satisfaction or a soft, almost inaudible chuckle, indicating some internal correlation of facts that remained, for the moment, locked within his formidable mind. I, meanwhile, found myself consigned to the more mundane duties of travel, attempting to decipher the local currency and sketching out a rough itinerary for our stay in Copenhagen, all while observing Holmes with a mixture of awe and mild exasperation. He spoke little, offered no preamble to his studies, and would merely nod abstractedly if I ventured a comment, his gaze already miles beyond the immediate horizon. Upon our arrival in Copenhagen, the crisp, bracing air and the sight of its ancient spires piercing the clear morning sky offered a stark and welcome contrast to the perpetual gloom of London. The city, vibrant and bustling, with its grand architecture and labyrinthine canals, seemed ill-suited to harbour the insidious malady Professor Lund had described. Yet, the gravity of our mission hung heavy in the air. We were met on the quay by a man of solid, reassuring build, whose uniform of dark blue and neatly trimmed beard bespoke authority without arrogance. This was Inspector Knudsen of the Copenhagen Police, a man introduced to us by Professor Lund as being of unimpeachable honesty, if a trifle conservative in his interpretations of the unusual. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson," Knudsen greeted us, his English deliberate and precise. "Professor Lund has apprised me of the unique nature of your inquiry. While I confess to a certain professional skepticism regarding the involvement of suspectors in matters of property dispute, I am instructed to offer you every courtesy and assistance." Holmes offered a brief, polite nod. "Your skepticism is commendable, Inspector. Mine is directed not at the possibility of a ghost, but at its existence. The actions of men, however, rarely surprise me." Knudsen cleared his throat. "Indeed. I have a carriage waiting. The affected villages lie a short distance south, beyond Coge. We can be there by midday." The journey took us away from the vibrant capital, through stretches of picturesque countryside, neat farms, rolling fields, and small, orderly hamlets. But as we drew closer to our destination, a subtle change occurred. The land seemed to hold its breath. The usual sounds of rural life, the distant bleating of sheep, the call of a farmer, the laughter of children, gradually receded, replaced by an unnerving quietude. Our destination was a cluster of dwellings known colloquially as Odegård, a name which, upon being translated by Knudsen, chilled me to the bone, deserted farm. As our carriage creaked to a halt on a dusty track, the silence that descended upon us was profound, broken only by the gentle sighing of the wind through unattended fields. The scene that greeted us was one of melancholic desolation. Houses, once clearly cherished, stood empty, their windows like vacant eyes staring out at the world. A child's wooden toy lay half-buried in the dust near a doorstep. A small, neatly stacked pile of firewood stood ready, as if for an evening that would never come. In one window, a half-drawn curtain hinted at a hasty departure, a life interrupted mid-sentence. "It is precisely as Professor Lund described," I murmured, a shiver running down my spine despite the mild air. "The signs of hurried abandonment are everywhere." Inspector Knudsen sighed heavily. "These were good people, Dr. Watson. Hard-working. To leave all this, something truly extraordinary must have driven them." Holmes, however, was already in motion. His eyes, typically half-closed in contemplation, were now wide and searching, darting from one detail to the next. He stooped to examine a patch of damp earth near a well, his magnifying glass already produced from his coat pocket. He ran a gloved hand along the rough-hewn timber of a doorframe, then knelt to inspect the base of a particularly sturdy oak. He moved with a quiet intensity, a hunter tracking the subtlest of spoor. "Observe, Watson," he said, without looking up, his voice barely above a whisper. "The grass here, beneath this window, notice the slight browning at the edges, extending a mere foot or so from the wall. And the well-trodden path leading to the spring, entirely free of new growth, yet the edges show no signs of recent footfall, only the settled dust of a month or more." Knudsen looked baffled. "What does it signify, Mr. Holmes?" "Only that the abandonment was swift, Inspector, but not necessarily immediate. There was a period of sustained disuse before the final departure. And the browning of the grass, curious. Not typical of drought, nor frost at this time of year." He then walked into one of the deserted cottages. The air within was stale, heavy with the ghosts of forgotten lives. A half-eaten loaf of bread sat on a table, covered in a fine layer of dust. A knitting basket, its contents spilling out, lay beside an empty armchair. Holmes surveyed the room, his gaze sweeping the ceiling, the floor, the sturdy timber beams. He tapped lightly on a wall, then listened intently, his head cocked to one side. He picked up a chipped ceramic cup, turning it over in his fingers, then sniffed at its interior. No scent of sulfur, no inexplicable chill, no ectoplasmic residue, Holmes finally announced, replacing the cup with a delicate click. The only discernible phenomena are the rather vivid imaginations of the populace and the tangible, though perplexing, evidence of their sudden flight. This is not the work of a supernatural agency, gentlemen. This is a scientific problem, masquerading as a ghostly visitation. And it suggests an insidious opponent, one who understands the delicate balance between fear and physiology, and possesses the means to exploit it. Knudsen, though still perplexed, looked visibly relieved. The tangible, however menacing, was always preferable to the spectral in the eyes of a police inspector. I, on the other hand, felt a familiar thrill. The game, as Holmes would say, was indeed afoot. And the scent of danger, far more potent than any lingering cooking smell in the deserted kitchens, was now unmistakably in the air. Chapter 3: The Ailments of the Afflicted and the Shadow of Madsen. Our initial reconnaissance of Odegaard had solidified Holmes's conviction that we were dealing not with spirits, but with the machinations of man. The uncanny silence of the deserted village, the suddenness of the exodus, and the peculiar nature of the alleged haunting had sharpened his focus considerably. Our next step was clear: to interview those who had suffered the brunt of this unseen attack. Inspector Knudsen, proving himself an invaluable ally despite his initial skepticism, had arranged for us to speak with several displaced families now residing in a makeshift community hall on the outskirts of Coge. The room, usually a cheerful venue for local gatherings, was now a place of somber reunion for those who had lost their homes to an unseen adversary. One by one, they came forward, their faces etched with a blend of fear, confusion, and a deep-seated weariness. They were simple folk, farmers, fishermen, a cooper, a baker, whose lives had been turned upside down. Their tales, though recounted by different individuals, were eerily consistent, forming a tapestry of terror woven with threads of the inexplicable. It began subtly. Herr Holmes, an elderly woman with gnarled hands, who introduced herself as Fru Svensson, began, her voice trembling slightly. A feeling, more than a sound, at first. A sort of pressure in the air. Like the moment before a great storm, but without the thunder. Then the hum, a stout fisherman named Lars interjected, nodding vigorously. Always there, a low, buzzing note. Not loud, mind you, but it got under your skin. Like a wasp trapped inside your head. It never stopped. Day and night. As they spoke, a chilling pattern emerged. Each person described a pervasive, low-frequency hum that seemed to penetrate the very fabric of their being, fraying nerves and stealing sleep. This was almost invariably followed by a cluster of distressing physical symptoms. "My head," whispered a young mother, clutching her temples. "The pains were like hammers behind my eyes. And the spinning! I could not stand without falling, and everything swam before my vision." "And the sickness," added her husband, his face pale at the memory. "A terrible nausea. My stomach felt as though it were churning sour milk. We could keep nothing down." But it was the psychological effects that seemed to have been the most potent weapon in this invisible arsenal. A universal sense of dread, profound and unreasoning, gripped each villager. It was as if an evil presence filled the house, a small boy recounted, huddling close to his father. "My bed felt cold, even under the blankets. I would wake up screaming, seeing shadows that weren't there. Hearing whispers that spoke no words, only menace. Fear," Dr. Watson, Fru Svensson concluded, tears welling in her eyes. "Such a fear as I have never known. It drove us from our homes. It still haunts our dreams." My medical training immediately registered the peculiar uniformity of their afflictions. These were not the disparate symptoms of hysteria or mass delusion. The constant hum, the headaches, vertigo, nausea, and the acute psychological distress, taken together, they suggested an external, environmental agent. There was no fever, no rash, no indication of an infectious disease. This was no contagion of the body, but a targeted assault upon the senses and the mind. It pointed towards a deliberate, non-random cause, almost as if a specific set of stimuli were being applied. I made careful notes, detailing the onset, duration, and specific manifestations of each symptom, correlating them across individuals. Holmes, meanwhile, listened with an unnerving stillness, his gaze shifting from speaker to speaker, absorbing every nuance, every tremor of voice, every evasive glance. He interrupted only rarely, his questions sharp and precise. "Did anyone attempt to resist this presence?" he asked one burly farmer. "Resist?" the farmer scoffed bitterly. "How do you fight something you cannot see, cannot touch, only feel?" It was like trying to wrestle the wind. It drove you mad slowly, day by day, until you had no choice but to flee. Then, almost inevitably, the name that Professor Lund had mentioned began to surface with increasing frequency. Before all this started, Lars the fisherman grumbled, "That snake, Madsen, he tried to buy up all the land. Offered us a pittance. Said our homes were worthless." Soren Madsen, the young mother echoed, her voice laced with venom. "He sent his agents, threatening us, saying the land would be taken anyway, whether we sold or not. He appeared in the region months ago," Fru Svensson added, "a new, grand house built near Koj, away from the coast, but close enough to know what was happening. Everyone said he was sniffing around the old mines." Holmes's eyes, which had been narrowed in contemplation, now gleamed with a predatory intelligence. He made a subtle gesture to Knudsen, who understood instantly and began taking down the names and specific grievances against Madsen. "It grows clearer by the hour, Watson," Holmes murmured to me as we departed the hall, leaving the displaced villagers to their communal grief. "The ghosts, as the inspector and I suspected, are merely a calculated illusion. This is not some ancient evil, but the cold, hard logic of profit and a particularly cruel method of social engineering. My initial theory of sensory deprivation and resonance grows stronger with every testimony. This Madsen, it would seem, is a man who understands that the most effective way to dispossess a people is not through force, but through fear, a fear so profound it warps reality itself." I could only agree. The meticulous detail in the villagers' accounts, the consistency of their symptoms, and the sudden, opportunistic appearance of Soren Madsen all coalesced into a single, terrifying hypothesis. We were hunting not a phantom, but a ghostmaker, a man who wielded the invisible forces of physics as his weapon. Chapter 4: A Web of Finance and Subterranean Secrets. Having gathered the distressing testimonies of the displaced villagers, Holmes's attention, with characteristic swiftness, shifted entirely towards Soren Madsen. The man was no longer a mere rumor, a name whispered in conjunction with low offers, but the central figure in this unfolding drama, the spider at the heart of this web of engineered terror. "Watson," Holmes declared, as we sat in our modest Copenhagen lodgings, the pervasive scent of strong coffee mingling with the faint odor of burnt tobacco from his incessant pipe, "our phantom, it appears, possesses a balance sheet. The supernatural is merely a conveniently drawn veil for avarice." Our initial inquiries into Madsen's background revealed a profile that, while impressive in its financial success, painted a picture of a man utterly devoid of scruples. Soren Madsen was a self-made industrialist, a titan in the burgeoning fields of precision engineering and, more recently, mineral extraction. His reputation was formidable, whispered in the hushed tones reserved for those whose wealth buys them a certain immunity from conventional morality. He was known for his ruthlessness, his uncanny ability to foresee economic trends, and an unwavering focus on profit that eclipsed all other considerations. He had a penchant for acquiring failing enterprises, stripping them bare, and selling off the profitable remnants, leaving behind a trail of despondent workers and empty factories. "A man who profits from ruin," Holmes mused, tapping a finger against a newspaper clipping detailing one of Madsen's more audacious takeovers. Such a disposition would find little difficulty in orchestrating the ruin of a few hundred villagers for a sufficiently tempting prize. Our task, therefore, became twofold: to confirm Madsen's direct involvement in the hauntings and, more importantly, to ascertain the nature of the prize that could justify such a diabolical scheme. Inspector Knudsen, having overcome his initial skepticism, proved invaluable. He quietly facilitated access to public records, land registries, and corporate filings that would otherwise have been beyond our reach. What Holmes uncovered was a complex and subtly concealed network of acquisitions. Over the past 18 months, several shell corporations, with convoluted ownership structures tracing back to Madsen's primary holding company, had quietly purchased vast tracts of land in the vicinity of the Coge Bay. Not the fertile farmland, mind you, nor the picturesque coastal properties, but rather the ostensibly less desirable, rocky, and forested parcels, including several abandoned quarries that had long since ceased operation. The prices paid were surprisingly low, often barely above market value, attracting little attention. "Observe, Watson," Holmes pointed with a pencil to a map spread across our table, intricately annotated by his hand. "Here are Odegaard and the other affected villages. And here," his pencil jabbed at the map, "are Madsen's recent acquisitions. Notice the curious geological congruence. These parcels, seemingly disparate, form a rough semicircle around our haunted zone. And within that semicircle, according to Professor Lund's geological survey maps, lies a significant, though hitherto unexploited, geological formation." Professor Lund, a man of quiet scholarship, had been tasked by Holmes with an urgent and discreet mission to provide detailed geological surveys of the Coge Bay region. Lund returned with his findings, his brow furrowed in scientific wonder and concern. Beneath the very lands where the villagers had lived for generations, dormant and undiscovered until recent, more advanced seismic explorations, lay a rich vein of precious garnets, small, yet of exceptional clarity and color, highly prized in the jewelry trade. The potential yield was astronomical. The pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with a chilling precision. Madsen's motive was laid bare: unimaginable wealth. The garnets, concealed beneath the ancestral homes of unassuming villagers, represented a treasure trove he desired to claim for himself, unencumbered by inconvenient land rights or the need to share profits. The ghosts were merely a sophisticated, cruel, and scientifically engineered tool of corporate espionage and land acquisition. "The ruthlessness of the man is quite breathtaking," I remarked, a cold knot forming in my stomach. To inflict such psychological torture for mere stones. "Mere stones, Watson, can command empires," Holmes corrected, a grim expression on his face. "And Madsen, it seems, has ambitions beyond that of a simple industrialist. To achieve this, he required the land vacated without suspicion, without a costly public battle, and without any claim on the mineral rights from the previous owners. Superstition, fear, and scientific cunning proved to be his chosen instruments. With a clearer understanding of Madsen's ambition, Holmes deemed it necessary to undertake a covert surveillance of the contested areas. We returned to the desolate villages, this time with a more precise mission. Holmes, with his field glasses and discerning eye, meticulously scanned the terrain surrounding Madsen's recently acquired properties. It was not long before we found fresh evidence of activity. Subtle, yet undeniable. Newly laid tracks of heavy vehicles, though partially obscured by hastily scattered brush, led from a nearby road into a thickly wooded copse bordering the deserted farmlands. In a secluded hollow, Holmes's keen eye spotted what appeared to be a newly erected structure, meticulously camouflaged with natural foliage and netting, blending almost perfectly with the surrounding trees. It was far too substantial to be a mere hunting lodge or storage shed. Furthermore, a faint, almost invisible glimmer of metallic wire could be discerned snaking its way from the disguised structure, disappearing into the undergrowth towards the abandoned villages. A modern castle of villainy, Watson, Holmes observed, his voice low but charged with triumph. Discreetly constructed, perfectly positioned. The lair of our unseen spectre. The lines of communication are now clear. We have our villain, we have his motive, and we have a strong indication of his method. All that remains is to gather the irrefutable evidence that will bind him to his monstrous design. The air, which had seemed merely still in our previous visit, now hummed with a different kind of tension, the crackling energy of impending confrontation. The hunt was nearing its climax. Chapter 5: The Science of Fear, Infrasound and Microwaves. The following evening found us once again in our Copenhagen lodgings, the air thick with the scent of pipe tobacco and the unspoken anticipation of revelation. Inspector Knudsen sat opposite Holmes, his face a study in patient skepticism, while I prepared my notebook, a thrill of familiar excitement coursing through me. Holmes, having spent the better part of the day in a flurry of calculations, cross-referencing maps, and consulting esoteric scientific texts procured by Professor Lund, finally laid out his findings. "Gentlemen," Holmes began, drawing deeply on his pipe, the smoke curling languidly towards the ceiling, "we are dealing with a man whose intellect, perverted as it is formidable. Mr. Soren Madsen has not employed crude strong-arm tactics, nor the conventional methods of intimidation. No, his genius lies in his understanding of human physiology and psychology, and his willingness to exploit them with a truly diabolical application of modern science." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. Inspector Knudsen shifted uncomfortably, but his gaze remained fixed on Holmes. The villagers spoke of ghosts, of unseen forces, of a pervasive sense of dread. Holmes continued, his voice taking on the measured tone of a lecturer. They described a low, maddening hum, headaches, vertigo, nausea, and a profound, inexplicable terror. Dr. Watson, with his medical acumen, quickly observed the consistency of these symptoms, dismissing the notion of a shared delusion or contagion. "Indeed," I interjected. "The symptoms point not to a psychological aberration, but to an external, physical cause, acting upon the body and mind in a highly specific manner." "Precisely," Holmes affirmed, a quick glance acknowledging my contribution. "And the key, gentlemen, lies in two separate, yet complementary, forms of invisible energy, infrasound and low-level microwave radiation. Knudson's brow furrowed. Infrasound? Microwaves? What is this sorcery, Mr. Holmes? No sorcery, Inspector, but pure physics, albeit applied with malevolent intent. Infrasound refers to sound waves with frequencies below the lower limit of human audibility, typically 20 Hz. While we cannot consciously hear them, their presence is often felt. Certain frequencies of infrasound, even at relatively low intensities, are known to have profound psychological and physiological effects on the human body. Holmes picked up a pencil, tapping it rhythmically against the table to illustrate his point. Imagine, if you will, being subjected to a vibration that resonates with the natural frequencies of your internal organs, or even the cavity of your skull. It produces not a sound, but a pervasive pressure, a feeling of unease and subtle nausea. At particular frequencies, infrasound can induce feelings of dread, sorrow, anxiety, even profound panic. It can cause disorientation, dizziness, and a general sense of being unwell. Some studies even suggest it can trigger visual or auditory hallucinations. The whispers and shadows the villagers reported, perhaps, were merely the mind attempting to rationalize these unseen stimuli. I recalled the elderly woman's description of a pressure in the air, like the moment before a great storm. The pieces were rapidly fitting together. This, Inspector, Holmes pressed on, accounts for the low hum felt in the bones, the inexplicable terror, the vertigo, and the pervasive sense of a malevolent presence. Madsen or his engineers would have strategically placed powerful infrasound generators, perhaps disguised or buried, within the vicinity of the villages. But what of the headaches, the acute sickness? I asked. While infrasound explains much of the psychological torment, the physical debilitating effects seemed almost too severe for it alone. An excellent question, Watson, and it leads us to the second, equally insidious component of Madsen's scheme, targeted, low-level microwave emissions. Knudson looked utterly bewildered. Microwaves? Like for cooking, Mr. Holmes? In principle, yes, Inspector, but at vastly reduced power and specifically modulated frequencies. Microwave radiation, even at levels far below those used for heating food, can disrupt cellular functions and interfere with neurological processes. Applied subtly and continuously, it can induce a host of debilitating symptoms. Headaches, often described as a pressure behind the eyes, are a common complaint. Dizziness, confusion, a general malaise, even a temporary impairment of cognitive function can be brought about by prolonged exposure. It degrades the body's natural resilience, exacerbates the effects of the infrasound, and contributes directly to the nausea and profound physical discomfort the villagers endured. Holmes leaned back, his eyes surveying our reactions. Consider the cumulative effect, gentlemen. A constant, subliminal assault on the senses and the nervous system. The infrasound-inducing psychological terror and disorientation, the microwaves causing physical sickness and confusion. The combination is diabolical. The villagers weren't merely haunted, they were systematically made sick, disoriented, and terrified to the point of flight, all by invisible, scientifically orchestrated means. They truly believed their lands were cursed, their minds under attack by malevolent spirits, when in fact, they were being targeted by a cold, calculating machine designed to drive them away. Knudsen, who had listened intently, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to dawning comprehension, finally let out a long, slow breath. "Good heavens, Mr. Holmes! Such a thing, it is monstrous. To use science, not for good, but for such wickedness." "Indeed, Inspector," Holmes concurred, a grim satisfaction in his tone. "The brilliance of the scheme lies in its elegance and its cruelty. No violence, no overt crime, merely the insidious manipulation of environmental physics to achieve a desired outcome. A slow, psychological siege, leaving behind only deserted villages and a man poised to claim his ill-gotten gains. The ghosts of Coge Bay are merely echoes of Soren Madsen's ambition, magnified by the unseen forces he so cleverly unleashed." The outline of the villain's plot was now horrifyingly clear. We knew the how, and we understood the why. All that remained was to find the where, the precise location of these unseen weapons, and to gather the irrefutable evidence that would condemn Soren Madsen and restore peace to the fog-shrouded shores of Zealand. Chapter 6: A Perilous Return to Odegaard. With the villain's modus operandi laid bare, the subsequent course of action became unequivocally clear. Holmes, with his usual efficiency, wasted no time in drawing up a plan. "Our task now, gentlemen," he announced, addressing Inspector Knudsen and myself, "is to verify the location of these devices and gather concrete evidence of their operation. Madsen is a man who deals in the unseen, but even the unseen must have a point of origin." The plan was daring, necessitating a return to the very heart of the engineered terror. This time, however, we would not merely observe, we would seek out the tangible manifestations of Madsen's insidious science. Inspector Knudsen, his initial skepticism now replaced by a grim determination, expressed his willingness to accompany us, recognizing the severity of the crime and the need for irrefutable proof for a successful prosecution. Holmes, ever resourceful, had spent the afternoon preparing our tools of the trade. These were not the conventional implements of detection, but rather an assortment of scientific instruments, some modified by his own ingenious hand. There was a delicate, almost archaic-looking barometer, repurposed to detect minute atmospheric pressure changes, a custom-built, highly sensitive microphone connected to a rudimentary oscilloscope, designed to visualize extremely low-frequency vibrations, and a shielded, directional electromagnetic field detector, akin to what one might use to trace power lines, but recalibrated for the specific microwave frequencies Holmes suspected. Each device, though seemingly simple, represented Holmes's profound understanding of the forces at play. "We must approach under the cloak of darkness," Holmes instructed, meticulously packing the equipment into a sturdy, canvas satchel. "The cover of night will not only conceal our movements but will also intensify the effects of Madsen's devices, making their detection all the more discernible." As the last vestiges of twilight faded into a starless Danish night, our small party, Holmes, Knudsen, and I, set out towards Odegaard. The air was still and remarkably cold for the season, a premonition of the chill that awaited us. We left our carriage a good distance from the village, proceeding on foot through the shadowed lanes and overgrown fields. The silence, which had been eerie in daylight, now pressed in on us with an almost physical weight, amplifying every rustle of leaves, every distant hoot of an owl. As we crossed the invisible threshold into the affected zone, a subtle change became apparent. A faint, almost imperceptible hum began to register, not in my ears, but deep within my chest, a low vibration that resonated unsettlingly through my bones. Inspector Knudsen shifted uneasily beside me, his hand instinctively going to the hilt of his service revolver. "You feel it, Inspector?" Holmes murmured, his voice barely audible above the rising internal pressure. Knudsen nodded, his face taut. "A strange feeling, Mr. Holmes. Like the air is thick. And a cold dread, despite my reason. I, too, began to experience the full force of Madsen's unseen arsenal. A dull, throbbing ache started behind my eyes, slowly radiating through my skull. My stomach churned, a vague nausea rising, and a profound sense of unease settled upon me. It was not the terror of a physical threat, but a primal, unreasoning fear, as if my very instincts were screaming for me to flee, even as my conscious mind struggled to maintain its scientific composure. Holmes, however, seemed to thrive on the challenge. He moved with a heightened sense of purpose, his head cocked, listening to the very fabric of the atmosphere. He occasionally paused to consult his instruments. The oscilloscope flickered with chaotic, yet rhythmic, waveforms, confirming the presence of extremely low frequencies. The electromagnetic detector began to register faint, intermittent signals, its needle quivering. "They are active, gentlemen," Holmes pronounced, his voice tight with controlled excitement. "And potent. The source appears to be originating from the northwestern sector of the village, beyond the old mill." We pressed on, the oppressive atmosphere growing more intense with every step. The nausea became more pronounced, the headache a persistent drumbeat. My vision occasionally blurred, and I had to fight a rising sense of disorientation. It was a terrifying testament to the insidious nature of Madsen's weapons to be so profoundly afflicted, yet to see no visible enemy, no tangible cause. Following Holmes's unerring lead, we navigated through thickets of gnarled trees and over uneven, neglected ground. Finally, through a parting in the dense foliage, we saw it. Nestled deep within a cleverly concealed hollow, shielded by a natural rise in the land and obscured by expertly placed camouflage netting, stood a structure. It was low and squat, built of reinforced concrete, with no visible windows. A faint, almost inaudible throbbing emanated from its heart, a vibration that seemed to penetrate the very ground beneath our feet. Several thick cables snaked from its base, disappearing into the earth, their path precisely matching the faint glints of metallic wire Holmes had observed earlier. "The lair of our phantom," Holmes whispered, a note of grim satisfaction in his tone. "And from its heart, the invisible threads of terror are spun." The building hummed with a low, menacing energy, a silent sentinel of Madsen's ruthless ambition. It was the physical embodiment of the fear that had driven an entire community from their homes. We had found the source. Now, the delicate task of unmasking its operator and securing the evidence lay before us. Chapter 7: Unmasking the Operator. The camouflaged structure, emanating its low, malevolent thrum, stood as a monument to human ingenuity twisted to villainous ends. Holmes, his senses finely tuned by the oppressive atmosphere, moved with the stealth of a cat burglar. Inspector Knudsen and I followed close behind, our pulses quickening with a mixture of apprehension and grim resolve. "The entrance must be cleverly concealed," Holmes whispered, examining the reinforced concrete walls. "No conventional door would suit a facility designed to operate in secret." He circled the perimeter twice, his magnifying glass scanning every seam and crevice. Finally, near a patch of cleverly arranged dense ivy, he detected a faint outline. "Here, Watson." A pressure plate, perhaps, or a magnetic lock. Crude, yet effective for its intended purpose. With a set of finely honed picks, extracted from a small leather case, Holmes worked with astonishing speed and delicacy. A soft click echoed in the pre-dawn stillness, and a section of the wall, disguised to perfection, slid inward with a barely perceptible sigh of hydraulics. The air inside was thick and stale, but the oppressive hum was magnified tenfold. My headache pulsed with renewed vigor, and a wave of nausea threatened to overwhelm me. But the sight that met our eyes momentarily eclipsed my physical discomfort. It was a veritable chamber of scientific horrors. Arrayed along one wall were several large, metallic spheres, humming with a barely audible resonance, the infrasound generators. Wires snaked from them to complex control panels bristling with dials, gauges, and switches. On the opposite side, a series of gleaming parabolic dishes, subtly angled, were clearly the microwave emitters, their silent, invisible beams directed outwards towards the deserted villages. The entire operation was meticulously clean, highly advanced, and chillingly precise. Holmes, ignoring the debilitating effects of the machinery, moved with purpose. From his satchel, he produced a small, high-quality camera and began systematically documenting every aspect of the setup, the generators, the antennae, the intricate wiring, and, most crucially, the control panels. He meticulously photographed the settings, the power outputs, and the precise frequencies displayed on the gauges. "Look here, Watson," Holmes indicated, pointing to a ledger lying open on a small desk. "A logbook." Madsen, despite his cunning, could not resist the human urge for meticulous record-keeping. The dates of operation, the intensity of the emissions, even notes on the efficacy of the psychological impact upon the villagers, all recorded here in damning detail. He tore out several pages, tucking them carefully into a waterproof envelope. My eyes, though blurry from the incessant hum, caught a glimpse of a corporate logo on the ledger's cover, a stylized M intertwined with a lightning bolt, unmistakably belonging to Soren Madsen's conglomerate. We spent a tense hour in that technological den, gathering every scrap of evidence. The strain was immense, the unseen forces gnawed at our very nerves, threatening to undermine our resolve. Inspector Knudsen, his face pale and drawn, was clearly struggling, but his gaze remained resolute. With our proof secured, we retreated from the facility, resealing the hidden entrance behind us. The moment we stepped back into the relative quiet of the forest, the oppressive weight began to lift, though the lingering effects of headache and nausea persisted. "Now, Inspector," Holmes declared, his voice ringing with a newfound vigor, "we pay a visit to Mr. Soren Madsen. I imagine he is enjoying a most untroubled sleep, blissfully unaware that his ghosts have been unmasked. It was still early morning when our carriage pulled up to the imposing gates of Søren Madsen's lavish Copenhagen estate. The residence, a study in modern, stark architecture, radiated an aura of immense wealth and insulated power. Inspector Knudsen, flanked by two of his officers, approached the grand front door and rapped sharply. Madsen himself, a figure of polished composure, was eventually roused from his breakfast. He appeared in the doorway, impeccably dressed even at such an hour, his features sharp, his eyes shrewd and calculating. "Inspector Knudsen," Madsen greeted, a thin smile playing on his lips. "To what do I owe this early, and rather unexpected, intrusion?" His gaze flickered to Holmes and me, curiosity warring with a faint disdain. "Mr. Madsen," Knudsen began, his voice firm, "we are here regarding the villages near Coge Bay." Madsen's smile remained fixed. "Ah, the regrettable situation with the superstitious villagers. A pity, truly. Their abandonment of prime land presented a unique investment opportunity, of course, but I assure you, my acquisitions have been entirely legitimate." "Indeed," Holmes interjected, stepping forward, his voice calm, yet radiating an almost palpable authority. "Legitimate acquisition of deserted properties, perhaps. But the methods by which those properties became deserted, Mr. Madsen, are where your legitimacy ends." Madsen's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "I fail to comprehend your insinuation, sir. I am a businessman, not a ghost chaser." "You are a ghost maker, Mr. Madsen," Holmes corrected, holding up the envelope containing the photographic evidence and the logbook pages. "A creator of spectres, born not of folklore, but of infrasound generators and modulated microwave emissions. We have just returned from your clandestine facility near Odegård, complete with photographs of your machinery, schematics of your insidious network, and your personal log detailing the systematic terrorization of the Danish peasantry." The composure began to crack. Madsen's face, a moment before smooth and self-assured, now visibly paled. His gaze darted from Holmes to the evidence in his hand, then to the unyielding faces of the police officers. "Preposterous," he blustered, though his voice lacked conviction. "These are wild accusations, based on what, precisely?" "Superstitious nonsense and manufactured evidence." "Not nonsense, Mr. Madsen," I stated, my own indignation rising. "But a scientific assault. My colleague, Dr. Watson, has examined the victims. Their symptoms are textbook examples of exposure to precisely the conditions you so carefully engineered. Headaches, nausea, vertigo, and the overwhelming sense of irrational dread, all a direct consequence of your diabolical scheme to drive them from their lands." Holmes laid the evidence on a nearby table, allowing Madsen a clear view of the damning photographs and the neatly penned entries in his own hand. "Your ambition, Mr. Madsen, blinded you to the fundamental principles of law and humanity. The rich garnet veins beneath those villages were not yours to claim by force or by terror. Your meticulously planned haunting has been thoroughly debunked. Your invisible weapons have been rendered visible, and your ruthless motive exposed." Madsen stared at the evidence, his defiance crumbling. The carefully constructed facade of the respectable industrialist evaporated, revealing the petty, cruel tyrant beneath. His shoulders slumped, and the fight drained from his eyes. He knew he was caught. Inspector Knudsen stepped forward, his expression devoid of pity. "Soren Madsen, you are under arrest for the intentional endangerment of life, psychological torture, and the fraudulent acquisition of property. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you." As the officers moved to escort a now thoroughly broken Madsen from his opulent home, a profound sense of satisfaction settled over me. The terror that had gripped the villagers of Coge Bay, born of cold science and calculating greed, was finally brought to light. The ghosts had been laid to rest, and their creator brought to justice. Chapter 8: The Restoration and the Return. The unmasking of Soren Madsen sent a ripple of disbelief and outrage across Denmark. The sheer audacity of his scheme, the cold, scientific precision with which he had wrought such terror upon unsuspecting villagers, shocked the nation. Faced with Holmes's irrefutable evidence, the photographic records of his hidden facility, the detailed logbook entries, and the consistent testimonies of the afflicted, corroborated by Dr. Watson's medical observations, Madsen's defense crumbled. The legal proceedings were swift, and justice, for once, was served with uncommon efficiency. Soren Madsen, the ghostmaker, was convicted and faced a lengthy imprisonment, his vast fortune placed under investigation for restitution to his victims. With the villain incarcerated, the immediate priority shifted to dismantling the source of the terror. Under the watchful eye of Inspector Knudsen and a team of military engineers, the camouflaged bunker near Odegaard was systematically decommissioned. The infrasound generators, those silent orchestrators of dread, were silenced. The microwave antennae, which had radiated sickness and confusion, were taken down. As the nefarious machinery was removed piece by piece, a palpable sense of relief permeated the very air of the region. The pervasive hum ceased, the subtle pressure in the atmosphere dissipated, and the land, which had seemingly held its breath, slowly exhaled. The scientific community, though appalled by Madsen's heinous application of technology, was simultaneously fascinated. Reports of the case were published, not in the criminal dailies, but in obscure scientific journals, detailing the unprecedented use of such subtle, yet devastating, forces against a civilian population. It served as a stark reminder of the ethical tightrope walked by scientific advancement, and the eternal vigilance required to ensure its fruits were used for betterment, not malevolence. Slowly, tentatively at first, the villagers began to return. The fear, though deeply ingrained, began to recede with the certainty that the unseen tormentors were no more. Families, their lives uprooted and scattered, cautiously made their way back to their ancestral homes. The fields, once neglected, saw the return of plough and harrow. Children's laughter, long absent, echoed once more through the narrow lanes of Odegaard. The land was restored, but the memory of their torment, the indelible mark of the spectres, would undoubtedly linger for generations, a grim tale told by the fireside on cold Danish nights. Yet, life, as it always does, began to mend. As for Holmes, his satisfaction was profound, though, as always, expressed with characteristic restraint. The intellectual challenge had been met, the tangled knot of superstition and scientific villainy unraveled. His gaze, often distant and absorbed, now held a glint of quiet triumph. Our departure from Copenhagen was less dramatic than our arrival. Inspector Knudsen, now a firm believer in the unique methods of Baker Street, expressed his profound gratitude. Professor Lund, too, offered his heartfelt thanks, his academic curiosity satisfied, albeit with a heavy heart for the suffering endured. The sea voyage back to England provided me with ample time for reflection, a customary duty after our adventures. I sat across from Holmes, who was once again immersed in a tome of obscure chemistry, his mind already, no doubt, far removed from the Danish shores. I opened my journal, dipping my pen into the inkwell, and began to chronicle the events of the Spectre of the Sound. It was a case that highlighted, perhaps more vividly than any other, the deceptive nature of appearances. The most terrifying phantoms, I mused, were often not the stuff of ancient lore, but the meticulously crafted illusions born of human greed and intellect. Madsen had wielded science as a weapon, preying upon the most primal fears of man, achieving through unseen waves what no visible enemy could have accomplished without immediate reprisal. The greatest crimes, Watson, Holmes remarked suddenly, without looking up from his book, as if divining my very thoughts, are often those that defy immediate categorization. The villain who cloaks his malice in the guise of the inexplicable, who leverages the very laws of nature against his fellow man, is often the most dangerous. This case, my dear fellow, serves as a stark reminder that the most insidious spectres are frequently those conjured not by the supernatural, but by the depths of human depravity. I merely nodded, a profound sense of agreement settling upon me. As the shores of England gradually emerged from the Atlantic mist, I knew that the annals of crime had gained another unique entry, and that the world, once again, had been made a fraction safer by the tireless efforts of my extraordinary friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes.